Hi everyone, my name's Andrew and welcome to Jackawawa Studios. So before we start, a bit of a confession. I'm not a professional artist or a professional woodworker. I'm actually an accountant. I wasn't particularly good at art, woodwork or any of those creative subjects when I was at school, and a lot of the things I didn't get great marks for. But I have learned that you don't have to be a natural artist to get a lot of enjoyment out of doing artistic things. And that's the journey I wanted to share with everybody. So a few weeks ago I was on eBay and I bought this awesome emerald from Colombia. It came, it was certified, it was exactly what the supplier said. Unfortunately my skill level wasn't as good as I imagined and it quickly shattered into 1,000 pieces. But as part of the package, the supplier actually sent me this little free gift. And when I get it out of the packet, you'll be able to see it's a little white stone. I'm assuming it's not a diamond. It might be a cubic zirconia or a white sapphire. But it's kind of cute. It's kind of small. And I thought, hey, look, now that I've destroyed the emerald, maybe I can take this, put it onto a piece of wood and make a backing for a necklace pendant for it. So the first thing is to decide which wood to use. I tried the stone on a number of different woods and saw the contrast that it had with a lot of them. I like the darker woods and I think I ended up being on the ebony just because I like that contrast. So once I decided on the ebony, really the next step was to cut a small piece of ebony because I don't want to be working with anything that's too bulky. As you'll see later in the video, I'm actually using a small handcrafting tool to do the fine adjustments to this piece of wood, so I don't want anything that's too bulky. So the first thing I did was cut like a small vertical slice, and then I'm cutting a small horizontal slice here just so I can get that small bit that I can work with. Obviously a couple of minor camera adjustments as I try and actually get the camera to focus in on what I'm doing here. So I'm just using a coping saw to cut that small piece of ebony off the main piece of wood. And there I have my small blank that I'm going to use to make this necklace pendant. So once I'm happy with my blank, I'm going to actually use a piece of paper to draw the design rather than drawing it straight onto the wood. I just find this is a little bit easier to do. It's a little bit more natural to be drawing on paper, and also find that it's easier to rub out and start again if you want. You can do as many different pieces of paper as you want. There's really no consequences to doing that. So this is going to give me an idea really of what that design's going to look like in the end. It's enabling me to start visualizing that. Now, as you can see, I said I'm not a professional artist, and that's becoming pretty obvious pretty quickly. As I draw my design onto the wood, I'm changing it, I'm redesigning it, I'm adjusting the size and the pitch. But once I'm happy with that design, and it's starting to get towards what I want to have, I can take that design, cut it out, and actually lay it onto the blank of the wood, where I can then use a coping saw to cut off that excess wood. Once I've done my paper design, I've cut it out, I'm happy with that, I'm going to take that and lay it across the wood blank and actually use a pencil to trace around that so I can get the outside of the design onto the blank of wood, and then I'm going to be using a coping saw to cut off that excess piece of wood. The next step I've got to do is drill a couple of holes. So the first hole is going to be to inset the stone. So I'm going to use some calipers here. I got these from Aldi. They were on special for a couple of dollars, so they're pretty cheap. But they can tell me that the width of the stone is 5.4 millimeters. Luckily, I have a 5.5 millimeter drill bit, so I'm just going to drill a hole in the bottom of that where the design is and use that to inlay the gem. The other hole I'm going to drill is at the top of the design so I can attach that to a necklace. So as you can see here now, I've drilled both my holes. I'm tracing my design back in, and I'm not super happy with the way it's looking.
So if you just have a look at the design now, you can see that the bottom hole is off center. So when I've gone to drill that, the drill bit's actually moved, and I'm not really happy with the way that's looking. So I'm going to go back to the drawing board. I'm going to start again with another piece of ebony. So here I am sawing another piece of ebony off the same block, and I'm going to use a better process this time to make sure I actually have that design centered so that the jewel can sit right in the bottom. So same sort of process I've gone through. I've drawn the design on paper, sketched it all out, but this time I'm going to use those electronic calipers to actually measure the center of the piece of wood so I can get the jewel hole perfectly centered, because it just didn't look right otherwise. This time I'm also going to use a smaller drill bit to start the hole, and then a larger drill bit to actually make the inlay center for the hole. So in this case, just start with a smaller drill bit before I move on to that 5.5mm drill bit to drill the inlay. Now, as it's an inlay, I certainly don't want to go all the way through the bit of wood. It's got to sit the jewel in there, so I'm just going to test that. It looks good. The last thing I'm going to do is drill the top hole again to attach that to the necklace. So again, I'm using the calipers to make sure I've got this centered this time. And this time it's looking a little bit better. I'm a little bit more happy with the way that's looking as a blank. I can start now thinking about etching my design in there. So again, retracing the design onto the piece of ebony before I actually start doing any sanding or cutting around the finished design. So once I'm happy with that final design, I'm going to use the coping saw to remove the excess around the top of the design, just so I don't have to sand that all down. And then I'm going to use an orbital sander to actually get the intricate design in there. Now, one tip I do have is, you'll see I've got a pair of stab gloves on here. I think these are awesome. They cost about $6 on eBay, but they really do help you, preventing you from getting like stab injuries or sanding injuries. And for $6, I think it's a great investment. The second tool I'm using here is a rotary tool or a Dremel tool, and I'm using it with a sanding attachment. So you can buy different sanding attachments for these. I think the Dremel tool itself is about $80, so again, it's not expensive, 80 Australian dollars. And you can buy these additional attachments to it, again, from Amazon or eBay, delivered right to your door for probably about $10. So I'm just using a very fine sanding attachment here to actually sand in the majority of the design that I'm looking at for the final pendant. So once I've actually used the Dremel sanding attachment for this, I'm going to actually switch over to an engraving attachment. Because this piece of jewellery is actually quite fine and it's going to be quite detailed, the sanding attachment that you see on the Dremel there is probably too big to give it that final detail that we're looking for. Especially because the idea of this design is it's a twist, so it's like two pieces of rope that have been twisted together. So I'm going to change over to the engraving tool from the sanding tool once I've done the majority of the work around it, and then use that tool really to give it that sort of intricate design that we're looking for, so it actually looks like the twist that we want to bring to the piece of jewelry. So yeah, as I said, using those engraving tools, again, they're available on eBay. They're only a couple of dollars, but they certainly do give you an element of detail that's hard to get with just a sanding tool. Once I put that detail in there, I'm going to use the rotary sander again with a finer grain just to polish off the piece and to give it a final polish. I'm actually then going to take that and use some really fine grained sandpaper to give that piece a sort of final polished look. Because it is quite a small piece, it's quite important to give it a really polished look, because otherwise it's going to kind of look wrong with that gem sitting there. If you're doing a bigger piece, a bigger piece of sculpture or a bigger piece of carving, you don't necessarily have to do that. But as I said, once you put the gem in there, it is quite a fine piece, and you do want that wood to be really sort of solid and look like it's got a shine and a final finish on it. So yeah, just putting the gem in there to see what it's going to look like as a final piece. And then I'll finish it off with some sandpaper. So wet and dry sandpaper here, fine grit sandpaper. Again, nothing particularly unusual or difficult to find. And I'm just going to give that a final polish off with that sandpaper and to finish that design. Now, when I've finished this, it's actually going to come out looking a little bit sanded, I suppose is the best way to put it. it's going to come out with a little bit of dust on it and things like that. Now, I don't want that dust on there, so I'm going to actually apply some oil to that, just as an oil finish. Now, the oil will soak into the wood, so I'll leave that overnight to let that dry, but just applying some oil with a paintbrush. In this case, I'm using walnut oil, but you could use anything, you know, even olive oil or sunflower oil. But just apply that to it. That's going to give it a little bit of shine. It's going to get rid of all that dust on there, and it means that we're going to be able to come back tomorrow and set the gem. So once I've allowed that oil to dry, the next thing I need to do is set the gem into the pendant. So I'm just going to use a little bit of CA glue or super glue here. You could use an epoxy, that's no problems, I've used that before. But because this one is quite small, I'm going to use that CA glue to set that in there, and then just use a screwdriver to straighten it all up. Allow that to dry and we're almost ready to go. The last thing I want to do is put a little loop on the end of this pendant. That's so I can thread the pendant through a chain and it's going to sit flat when someone wears it. So again, these little loops are available from any sort of haberdashery store or any sort of jewelry store. And you can just buy a packet of those and then use a chain to thread that on there. Now, I haven't made this chain. This is a chain I just bought off the internet again. And again, I can use that to just thread that on there. And we're pretty much ready to go. So that's our pendant finished. Thread it onto a chain, and I think it's looking pretty good. If you like my stuff, hit subscribe, or if you think I should have used a different wood, let me know in the comments. Also, most of my stuff is available on my Etsy store, the link you can see in the video.